Good afternoon. Been a little while. So, violence. Violence was on my mind today. Not that I wanted to do violence so much as just the concept of violence. And I guess the utility of violence, or the necessity of violence, or the inevitability of violence. I read something recently. Somebody was talking about how violence is not biological, that it's like a learned behavior, and it's kind of the trauma-informed sort of perspective on violence, that people learn that, and and that's why they do that, and so we can I guess the idea would be break out of cultural violence, or a culture of violence, and attain, I don't know, some sort of utopian non-violent society at some point in the future. And so, just thinking about it, it's a reasonable question, right? Is violence nature or nurture, right? And you can ask that about a lot of things. But sure, violence is an interesting one to look at from that perspective. And to be sure, humans learn behaviors, right? We can train into and out of behaviors as a society, and societies change. I think the, pandemic is a good example of how a new normal can be obtained in relatively short order with enough incentive and social pressure, and people will conform to whatever the agenda is fairly rapidly, right? But if you consider human beings animals in any respect, you have to at least examine the biological perspective, right? And we talk about, genotype or phenotype, or genetic expression, right? And the way, traits manifest in creatures. Certainly we're creatures, if nothing else, governed by genetics in at least some respect, and things like, mutable characteristics, hair color, eye color, your body makeup in a variety of ways are clearly genetic. And even those maybe can be influenced by society and culture to a degree. But your genetics, it's a chemical process, right? But it extends beyond that, right? Think about behaviors like nest building, or like beavers building dams, right? They don't have dam building school for beavers. As far as we understand, they don't have complex language or abstract thinking, or the ability to communicate ideas the way humans do. So, really that behavior is instinctive, right? You'd say almost entirely instinctive, right? Nest building, dam building, those sorts of behaviors. Even like ravens, tool making, right? Or certain birds, maybe it's ravens, make tools to solve problems. And is that technology, or is that biology, right? Is that learned behavior, or is that genetic and instinctive behavior? And I would say largely you can attribute those behaviors to instinctive behaviors. And humans are instinctive creatures in many ways. If you talk to people like Sam Harris, who are, kind of the belief that humans don't actually have free will, that free will is an illusion, and that you can kind of peel the veil back on the illusion of free will and consciousness through things like meditation, or maybe even like DMT and things like that. I don't know if I buy that, But I mean, to a degree, yes, humans are instinctive, and a lot of like the source of our thoughts and feelings and emotions, I mean, it's an enigma to us, right? When thoughts arise in our heads, where do they come from? And I mean, in some respect, right, those thoughts and feelings especially, right, those sensations are a feature of our biology, right? Our perception of the world, and the chemical reaction of those nerve impulses, acting on different parts of our brain or other parts of our anatomy, right? So, and when we talk about behaviors generally, I think we can say it's true of humans that certain behaviors are instinctive or biological, right? So if you want to make the case for the social construction of violence, right, and say that this is cultural, this is learned behavior, that the humans are not by nature violent creatures, I think just based on empirical observation of life, of living things, violence is an nearly inevitable aspect of life, of existence for most forms of animate life, right? Like, I mean, zoological life. I mean, obviously trees don't engage in, violence per se, although, I mean, if you watch the English ivy out behind my house choking and strangling the pine trees to death, I mean, you want to call that violence in slow motion? I don't know. I mean, certainly it is, competition for scarce resources that lead to, survival of the fittest to a certain degree. And I'm not talking more generally about social Darwinism here. I don't think that there's any utility to violence and, survival of the fittest when it comes to humans. But generally speaking, competition for scarce resources, goes hand in hand with a lot of forms of life and violence. Apex predators, all the way down to, certain kinds of, zooplankton, or, small, invertebrate life that eats other things, right? But when you get to more complex creatures even, and you look at, a pride of lions or, primates, there's definitely violent behaviors. And, maybe to one degree or another, apes that are not humans have culture and society and communication, but even then, I mean, how much of that is analogous to nest building or dam building, right? What is an emergent behavior of instinctive action through biology, and what's social construction, right? Regardless, there's really no good examples throughout history of like pacifistic societies, right? And with a good reason, right? Up until the current era, pacifistic societies were dominated by aggressive societies, right? And there is certainly a competitive advantage, even among humans, for those who are willing to engage in violence to obtain the things that they want. I mean, we can talk about whether or not that's moral or ethical. I mean, certainly unprovoked violence, I think, is broadly accepted and considered to be not moral. And nevertheless, people do it, right? And we as a society have this tendency now to be, empathetic in the extreme, and to want to assume the best in everybody, and to carry the weight of their poor decision making in our collective hearts as kind of a symptom of broader social ills, and not really acknowledge any more personal responsibility. And personal responsibility has almost become kind of a dirty word. But I mean, you get down to brass tacks, right? People engage in behaviors and have the ability not to. You want to call that free will or not, I mean, okay, but let's call that a choice, right? Everybody has a choice as to whether or not they victimize somebody else for their own personal gain. And that's been true throughout human history, and in all likelihood well before. And in our nearest common ancestors and apes, it's true there too. And those apes engage in violence for their own personal gain for one reason or another, and they have dominance hierarchies. And you know, the biggest, strongest, you know, gorilla is gonna eat first, or there's a reason we have the euphemism, you know, of the biggest person or the biggest meanest person getting the lion's share of whatever, right? So there's clear benefit to engaging in that sort of behavior from a strictly, you know, utilitarian framework, right? On the individual level, right? I mean, it has utility for certain individuals to engage in antisocial and violent behaviors, and until that changes, right? Until we are in a post-scarcity society, you know, there will be an incentive for one person who has the physical ability to try and victimize another. And even then, if we reach a post-scarcity society, and there is no benefit to, you know, one person victimizing another for, you know, monetary reasons, say, the question still remains, you know, are there, you know, psychopaths out there who are, you know, just willing to do it for the thrill of it? I mean, clearly, you know, there's, you know, serial murderers and people who have compulsions to engage in violence. And we can talk about what the root causes are of those behaviors. But I don't think there's any reason to believe that we can eradicate that either. So even if we reached a post-scarcity society and people didn't feel any benefit to victimizing each other, there are still those who would do it for the mere pleasure or sport of it, because there's something wrong with them. And I think that's a valid value judgment to make. There's something wrong with people who inflicts harm for fun, for sport. And I don't think that should be controversial to say. And I think those people will always be with us. And so the thing that prompted me to ponder the topic today, I guess, was basically someone asserting, it's like, well, yeah, kind of like one of those faux conversations. You know, the man says, you know, you need me to protect you. And the woman says, from who? It's like, from evil, violent men. And the woman's like, why? It's like, well, because men are violent. And they're kind of like trying to paint this like self-justifying reason for men to excuse their own violence or something like that, which is just, it seemed like a silly thing to try and assert when violence is just a reality of life and of nature. And I mean, I think that's manifestly true. You can challenge me on that if you want, and I'd be happy to discuss it. But that is who we are as a species, and at least for the foreseeable future, that will remain who we are as a species. And so to then dismiss the need for some people to use violence in defense of themselves or others is, I think, a silly position to take, right? And I think it's naive, and it's a symptom of this toxically empathetic society that we're living in now. And I mean, empathy is a beautiful and wonderful feature of humans. Empathy is, on balance, a good for society, but anything, including empathy, can become toxic at excessive levels. And we do damage to ourselves as individuals and in society when we become overly empathetic to the point where we render ourselves harmless and incapable of preventing harm to ourselves and the people we care about from bad actors. And there are bad actors. And for whatever reason, be it, social construction or biology or some combination of the two, there are those who engage in violence for selfish reasons. And as long as those people exist, we will need individuals who are capable and willing to enact violence against those bad actors in defense of themselves and others. And so, like so many other things in life, violence is merely the exercise of power, right? And power can be many things, right? It can be knowledge, it can be skill, it can be authority, it can be wealth, or it can be sheer physical strength and violence executed against another person, right? And in many ways, all those things, knowledge, skill, ability, wealth, strength, prowess, aren't inherent evils, right? They're agnostic one way or the other, and the morality of those things is really just an emergent property of how they're utilized, right? And, great knowledge can be definitely something very evil, right? And we can use knowledge in the pursuit of selfish aims. We can use knowledge to harm. We can use knowledge to make the world worse for everyone around us. And I think certainly anybody who spends any time on social media can say, maybe knowledge and technology pursued for its own sake is not necessarily just an automatic good, right? And you can make that analysis of any sort of power, be it soft power or hard power. And I think there's a valid analysis to be made there too for violence. And violence is an agnostic description of, physical dominance in one way or another, right? And again, dominance gets, kind of turned into this dirty word in our toxically empathetic culture, and certainly there are ugly and immoral forms of dominance. Yes, absolutely, but there are definitely examples where it is not. And I mean, the best example off the cuff would be, athletics, friendly competition, right? And you can have a sports team or a individual player who's absolutely dominant in their field, right? They're unmatched in physical prowess because of their training and their skill and their physical ability, whatever else. The Michael Jordan, the Wayne Gretzky, whoever else, they're matchless in their mastery of that skill, and they are dominant in that field. And there's nothing wrong or evil about that. And so to say that dominance is inherently evil, is, I think, a fallacious thing to say. I think it is a morally agnostic thing. And so to say that we're going to dominate bad actors as a society through many avenues, including the use of physical force, is not an evil or immoral thing to say. And frankly, there are people, well-meaning, empathetic people, who just do not recognize and have not directly experienced that there are some individuals among us whose behavior will only ever be moderated by someone willing to use violence and establish dominance over that person, for the purpose of isolating them, sometimes physically isolating them and giving the rest of society a break from their behavior, and then giving them the opportunity to reform, right? And the root of the word penitentiary is penitence, right? And that was the original conception when Western penitentiaries were really starting to come into their own in the modern era, right? It was the idea that people could be reformed and you could change behavior, but that they needed that isolation, that opportunity to, reform and to repent of their wicked ways. Then you can't create those opportunities if you're not capable and willing to enact violence against violent people. And I don't think that's a self-justifying notion that because violence exists, you need to be capable of using violence. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what else to say about that. But I'd love to hear what any of you have to think on the subject. So yeah, drop a comment below if you think I'm right. If you think I'm wrong, let me know. Break down my analysis. Tell me where I'm wrong. Tell me what I haven't considered. It's been fun. Talk to you next time.